Under a low hill in southern Turkey stands a ring of carved stone pillars. Each one is taller than a person and weighs several tons, cut from solid limestone, stood upright in a great circle, and covered in carved animals: foxes, snakes, vultures, wild cattle. They were raised around 11,500 years ago, which makes them older than Stonehenge and older than the Egyptian pyramids by thousands of years. They are the oldest monumental architecture ever found anywhere on Earth. And the people who built them had no metal, no pottery, no writing, no wheel, and no farms. They were hunter-gatherers, living by hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. And with nothing but stone tools and their own hands, they quarried these pillars, carved them, stood them upright, used the place for centuries, and then deliberately buried the whole thing. That single fact, enormous monuments built before farming, broke 100 years of history books. It left a great many very serious archaeologists standing in a field, scratching their heads, because the order they had always taught for how civilization began had just turned out to be backwards. So let's ask the obvious things, the ones you'd ask if you walked up that hill yourself. Who were the people who raised these stones? How did anyone without metal tools cut and lift rock that heavy? What were the carved animals for? And why did they build something this enormous before they had so much as a single field of wheat? And then, after all that work, why did they bury it? We'll get to all of it soon. We have all night. But before we set out, if these slow journeys through history help carry you off to sleep, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. And we will be here to do this for you again, every single night. And if you have a favorite theory about who built this place, by the end of tonight, you'll have 4 good ones to choose from. So leave it down in the comments. We read them. So get comfortable. Turn the lights down low. Pull the blanket up and tuck your feet in where it's warm. And let's go back, past every kingdom and every empire, past the pyramids, past the very first farm that was ever planted, to a bare ridge of pale stone 11,500 years ago, where a few hundred people are about to do something nobody on Earth has ever done before. The hill has a name. In the local language, it's Göbekli Tepe, which means, more or less, potbelly hill, named for its round, swollen shape, the way it bulges up out of the flat plain like a full stomach after a very large meal. For most of recorded history, that was the single most interesting fact about it. A funny-shaped hill with a funny-sounding name. In 1963, a survey team from 2 universities walked across the top of it. They saw some broken slabs of limestone poking up out of the dirt and a scatter of old flint lying around. And they made a note that there was probably an old graveyard up here, nothing that couldn't wait. Then they moved on. And you cannot really blame them. A graveyard is a perfectly reasonable thing to find on a hill. It is the kind of answer that lets everyone pack up and go home for dinner. So the most important archaeological site on the planet sat there for another 30 years, filed away under "had a look, nothing special." Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to give it that second look. He had read the old survey notes, and where everyone before him had seen the tops of broken gravestones, something about the shape of those slabs would not leave him alone. So he climbed the hill. He looked at the stone, and he understood, more or less on the spot, that these were not gravestones at all. They were the very tops of enormous carved pillars, and the rest of each one was still down there, standing upright, buried up to the shoulders in the body of the hill. He is supposed to have said that he had two choices that day. He could turn around, walk back down, and say nothing to anyone. Or he could spend the rest of his life digging. He chose the digging. He ran the excavation for the next 20 years, and he never really stopped. When the first dates came back from the laboratory, they did the thing that good archaeology occasionally does, which is ruin everyone's afternoon. The stones were old. Not cathedral old. Not pyramid old. The oldest rings at Göbekli Tepe were raised around 9,500 years before the Common Era. Call it 11,500 years ago, give or take. Let me put that number somewhere you can actually feel it. Stonehenge, which most of us file under almost impossibly ancient, is about 5,000 years old. The Great Pyramid is about 4,500. Göbekli Tepe is roughly twice the age of either one. Put it this way. When the pyramids were going up, Göbekli Tepe had already been built, used, and buried for longer than the time that now separates us from those same pyramids. To the pharaohs, this place would already have been an ancient, half-forgotten thing, if they'd known about it at all. And here is the piece that rearranged the textbooks. For a very long time, the story of how civilization began went in a tidy order. First, people learned to farm. Farming gave them more food than they needed on the day. The spare food gave them spare time, and crowds, and villages. And only then, once they were settled and comfortable and sure of their next meal, did they get around to the grand, useless, beautiful things. The temples, the monuments, the carved art, the enormous symbolic projects you only attempt once your stomach is already full. Farming first, cathedrals later. That was the order, and for about 100 years more or less everyone agreed on it. Göbekli Tepe was built by people who had not invented farming yet. The monuments came first, and that single fact landed on the study of human history like a dropped plate. It sent archaeologists back to arguments they thought were settled, and it left a great many careful, credentialed people exactly where it leaves you right now, sitting up a little in the dark, asking how on earth that is possible. So who were they? The honest first answer sounds boring and turns out not to be boring at all. They were hunter-gatherers, not cavemen in the cartoon sense. No clubs, no dragging anyone around by the hair, none of that. These were people standing at the very end of the long age of hunting and gathering, right in the doorway of the settled farming world that was about to begin. They knew their land the way you know your own street. They knew where the wild gazelle moved with the seasons, and the wild boar, and the great herds of wild sheep. They knew which grasses came up heavy with grain you could grind into flour, and exactly when to go and cut them. They made fine, sharp tools out of flint and harder stone. They had fire, and rope, and baskets, and dogs. The dog was the one animal that had thrown in with us by then, the first of all our animal partnerships, already curled up by the fire 11,500 years ago. And they had hands like yours, a back that got tired like yours, a head full of names and grudges and jokes that we are never, ever going to hear. That is worth holding on to as we go up the hill with them, because it is easy to talk about a place this old as if it were built by some different species. It wasn't. It was built by people, the same model of person you are, who would look at you lying there, warm under a blanket at the end of a long day and recognize you on sight. Now, what did they actually build? Picture a ring, a great oval room, 10, 15, 20 meters across, its wall made of rough stone and packed earth. Set into that wall, evenly spaced, standing upright all the way around, a series of carved pillars. And then, in the open center of the ring, 2 more pillars, taller than all the rest, standing on their own and facing each other across the empty middle. These are the famous stones, and they are shaped like a capital letter T, a tall, upright shaft with a broad slab laid across the top, like enormous stone tuning forks, or the world's heaviest doorways with no walls attached. The biggest of them stand well over 5 meters tall. That is taller than 3 people standing on each other's shoulders, cut from a single block of limestone, weighing many tons, hauled upright by hand. Archaeologists have given the best explored ring a plain name, Enclosure D, and it is the one that tends to stop people in their tracks. Because look closely at those 2 tall pillars in the center, and they are not just slabs. Down the sides there are arms, a pair of arms carved in low relief, bent at the elbow. Follow them around to the front, and the arms end in hands, long, careful fingers brought together over the place where a stomach would be, very nearly touching. There's a belt carved around the waist, and hanging from the belt, a kind of loincloth. These pillars are people, not portraits. The tops are blank. There are no faces, but bodies. Enormous, faceless, standing stone people, arranged in a ring, with 2 of them in the very heart of it, forever facing each other, hands almost meeting in the middle. Whoever they were meant to be, ancestors, guardians, gods, the honored dead, someone we have no word for at all. They have been standing in that exact pose, one carved hand reaching toward another carved hand, since before any human being had planted a field. Which brings us to the question you've probably been holding since the start. How? How did people with no metal at all make these? The pillars were quarried out of the limestone shelf that the hill itself sits on. To shape them, people took stone tools, flint and harder rock, and they pounded and scraped and pecked away at the limestone, hour after hour, day after day after day, turning a buried ridge of rock into a standing figure taller than a house. No iron chisels, no steel, no power of any kind except muscle and patience. And then they moved the finished pillars, each one weighing in the tons, with rope and baskets and wooden levers and ramps of piled earth and a very large number of human shoulders, all pulling in the same direction at the same moment, because there were no draft animals broken to the harness yet, and no wheel to put a cart on even if they'd had one. And that very large number of people is the honest puzzle, the one that has never really gone away. A job like this needs hundreds of workers, fed and organized and pulling together for a long time. But the usual picture of this period is of small, scattered bands of hunters who followed the herds and kept moving. So where did the crowd come from? Who fed all those people while they hauled rock instead of hunting dinner? Who decided where each fox and each snake would go and made sure everyone stuck to the plan? We genuinely do not know. That is the silence at the center of this whole place. It is a big, strange, human-shaped silence, and once people started noticing it, it did not stay politely inside the universities. It got out into the wide world. And when a mystery this big gets out, people come to it carrying answers, some careful, some wild, all of them trying to fill the very same gap. We're going to walk through every one of them tonight. But first, two things that might explain how all those people got fed: the animals on the walls and the feast. Start with the animals, because the pillars are covered in them. Carved creatures everywhere, in low relief across the stone. Foxes, a lot of foxes, lean and baring their teeth. Wild boar, tusks out, bristles up the spine. Snakes, sometimes dozens of them at once, pouring down a single pillar like water down a window. Scorpions, tall, long-legged birds, cranes and the like. Wild cattle, the great aurochs with the long, curved horns. And vultures, big, heavy, unmistakable vultures, wings spread wide. This was not a friendly mural of farm animals, because there were no farm animals yet. This is the real bestiary of their actual world, the things that could bite you, gore you, sting you, poison you, or turn up to eat you once something else had finished the job. And these people took the most dangerous, most frightening parts of their world, and they carved them by hand onto the walls of the most important building they had, one careful tap of a flint pick at a time. Fear turned into art with enormous patience by someone who had every reason to be afraid. One stone in particular has become famous enough to earn its own nickname. It's called Pillar 43, and people know it as the Vulture Stone. On it, there's a large vulture with one wing crooked outward, oddly, almost like an arm held up. Around it and above it, there's a scatter of other figures, more birds, a scorpion, and, set right by the vulture's bent wing, a single round disc. Hold on to that circle, because we are going to come back to it later tonight. Some people believe it is the single most important circle ever carved by a human being. But here is the honest, slightly maddening truth about all of it. We do not know what any of it means. Not really. We don't know whether the foxes were dangerous spirits or friendly ones, whether the snake's art stood for death or water or family, whether the vulture stone is a story, a calendar, a gravestone, or a doodle that happened to get famous. The people who could have told us have been gone for 11,500 years, and they left their pictures without a single word of caption. It is the strangest kind of intimacy, a whole language of images made by hands like ours, sitting right there in front of us, close enough to touch, too old to read. So what was this place? When the world first heard about Göbekli Tepe, it arrived with a headline already attached, and the headline was 3 words long: World's First Temple. And you can see exactly why it stuck. Giant stone figures, standing in rings, covered in sacred-looking animals, built by people who hadn't even settled down yet. Of course, it's a temple, the oldest holy place on earth. It is a wonderful, clean, magazine cover idea. But the people who actually dig there have spent the years since carefully taking that headline apart, because the longer they dig, the more ordinary life they keep finding mixed in among the giant stones, hearths where cooking fires burned, old rubbish heaps, which are the single most reliable sign that human beings were living somewhere, for the simple reason that human beings produce garbage. Grinding stones by the thousand for crushing wild grain into meal. Heaps of flint debris, the leftovers of people sitting and making tools. Channels cut into the rock to catch and hold rainwater. This is not an empty temple that wandering nomads visited once a year and left spotless. People worked here and lived here, or right up against here. And that points at the warmest answer of the three, the one I keep coming back to. Look at all that food being processed. Grinding stones everywhere, big stone troughs and vessels, mountains of animal bone, the remains of wild grain handled at a scale far past what a single family eats for dinner. A lot of researchers now think a big part of what drew those scattered people to the hill over and over, year after year, was a feast, a gathering. You come in from the herds and the wild fields, you meet the other bands you only see a few times a year. You eat together until you can't move, and while everyone is here and fed and in a good mood, you all put your backs into the next stretch of wall, the next pillar. That is one very human answer to who fed the crowd. They fed each other. The building and the feasting and the coming together were all the same act. So the careful archaeologists have traded the word temple for a more careful one. They call the big rings communal, gathering places, special buildings, yes, but built by and for a scattered people who came together here and, for a while, felt like one people, which is, if anything, a warmer idea than a temple. Not priests and a god so much as a crowd, and a fire, and a feast, and the most ambitious building project any of them had ever seen, going up a little more each time they met. And here the story splits. Because a place this old, this strange, this seemingly impossible, does not just sit on its hill being mysterious. People build theories on top of it, the way those first people built rings of stone. And over the last 30 years, 4 big ones have gone up. Some come from the careful folk with the trowels and the brushes. Some come from very late-night television. We are going to walk through all 4, give each one its best possible day in court, and then tell you, honestly, where the evidence really stands. Get comfortable. This is the part everybody argues about. The first theory comes from Klaus Schmidt himself, the archaeologist who spent the better part of 20 years digging the place up. So of the 4, it walks in with the best credentials. He argued it in his own books and papers, and it became the headline that carried Göbekli Tepe around the world. He liked to put it in 5 words. First came the temple, then the city. Here is what he meant, laid out properly. Everyone had always assumed farming came first, and the grand building came much later, once people were settled and fed and sure of the next meal. But the rings on this hill went up before farming, so Schmidt turned the question around. Instead of asking what these people could afford to build, he asked what the building itself might have done to them. And he proposed a mechanism, a chain of cause and effect that runs like this. Raising these rings took hundreds of people, gathered in one place, fed for weeks or months at a stretch, coming back season after season for generations. You cannot feed a standing crowd like that by hunting alone, because the herds keep moving and the wild harvest is scattered and brief. But the hills around Göbekli Tepe happened to be thick with the wild ancestors of wheat and barley, growing in dense natural stands. If you needed to keep the same crowd fed in the same spot, year on year, the natural thing to do is to start managing those wild grasses, protecting a patch, clearing it, scattering seed where you want it, coming back to harvest on purpose. Do that for enough generations, without anyone ever sitting down and deciding to invent agriculture. And you have invented agriculture. And this corner of the world is, in fact, one of the places where farming really did first take hold. So in Schmidt's telling, the gathering came first, and farming grew up around it as the way to keep the gathering fed. The temple did not wait for the harvest. The harvest was invented to serve the temple. It is a genuinely beautiful idea, and you can feel why it electrified people when he first said it out loud, that the very first thing our species settled down for was not bread, but meaning, and the bread came along afterward to keep the meaning fed. So where does that idea stand today? Softer than it did when Schmidt first lit it up. The same years of digging that turned up all those hearths and grinding stones and rubbish heaps also complicated his clean, dramatic story. The more they find, the less it looks like a lonely temple raised by pure wandering nomads who happened to invent farming on the side. And the more it looks like a place where people were already part settled, already halfway into the new world, gathering and feasting and building and edging toward farming all at the same time. So religion-built civilization has cooled into something more tangled and more honest. That worship and settling down and farming all came up together, braided over centuries, and we are still working out which strand pulled which. Less of a thunderclap. And to a lot of people, including me, more interesting, because it means nobody planned it. It just grew. The second theory is the one that put Göbekli Tepe on 100 magazine covers and a great deal of television. And it starts with that round disc we set aside, the one carved beside the vulture's wing on Pillar 43. It comes from two researchers at the University of Edinburgh, an engineer named Sweatman and his colleague Tsikritsis, who published a paper arguing that the Vulture Stone is not decoration at all. It is, they say, a message, a date written in animals. Here is how their reading works. They treat the carved creatures on Pillar 43 as symbols for groups of stars, the way we draw a scorpion for the constellation Scorpius or a bull for Taurus. Read that way, they argue. The particular arrangement of animals on the stone matches the night sky as it would have looked at one specific moment, a moment they calculate, from the slow wobble of the stars across the ages at around 11,000 years before the Common Era. And that date, they point out, lands right on top of something real. Around then, the Earth was passing through the torrid meteor stream, a wide band of comet debris. Our planet still crosses twice a year. And around then, the climate took a sudden, savage turn back toward the cold. The long freeze the scientists call the Younger Dryas. So Sweatman and his colleague proposed that the Vulture Stone records a comet strike, a swarm of fragments coming down out of the torrids, remembered and carved by the survivors as both a date and a warning. The round disc beside the vulture, in their reading, is the comet itself. And you can feel why it caught fire, because it is so specific. It is not a vague, ancient people were wise. It is a date, a named meteor stream, and a climate disaster in the geological record that all seem to line up. When the pieces click together like that, it stops feeling like a guess and starts feeling like a code somebody finally cracked. So here is where it sits, and the honest note comes, as it so often does, from the people who actually dig the hill. Two of the lead archaeologists, Jens Notroff and Oliver Dietrich, published a direct reply to the Comet paper, with the rather pointed title, "More Than a Vulture." Their objections were every bit as specific as the claim. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe, they pointed out, were not made in a single moment. They are spread across many pillars in many buildings, cut and recut over centuries. So reading one pillar as a snapshot of one night's sky ignores how the whole place actually grew. The match between animals and constellations isn't fixed either. If you are free to choose which creatures count as stars and which patch of sky to lay them against, you can find very nearly any date you go looking for. And the famous disk carries no label telling us it is a comet. It could be the sun, or the moon, or one of the round objects that turn up elsewhere on the site, or something we simply have no word for. So it is not the accepted explanation. But, and this is exactly why it earns its airtime tonight, it is not a foolish idea either. And it is a wonderful thing to lie here in the dark and weigh for yourself whether or not Pillar 43 really is a calendar of catastrophe. The fact that we can stand in front of it 11,000 years later and argue the point in earnest is its own kind of marvel. The third theory is older as an idea than Göbekli Tepe is as a discovery, and its most famous living champion is the British writer Graham Hancock, who has argued it across a shelf of best-selling books and, more recently, in front of very large television audiences. Here is the case at full strength, because it deserves a fair hearing. During the last ice age, with so much of the world's water locked up in glaciers, the seas stood hundreds of feet lower than they do now, and vast stretches of coastline that today lie underwater were dry, fertile, livable land. Hancock proposes that somewhere out on those drowned coasts, a genuinely advanced culture grew up. Not spaceships and skyscrapers, but seafarers and astronomers and master builders, generations ahead of the scattered hunter-gatherers around them. Then, at the end of the Ice Age, in that same Younger Dryas window of catastrophe, the world turned over. Rapid melting, seas climbing fast, great floods, perhaps comet strikes, drowning that culture's coastal heartland and scrubbing away almost every trace of it. The survivors, he argues, scattered inland and across the world, carrying what they knew, the building, the sky watching, the first seeds of farming, and they handed it to the simpler peoples they washed up among. And this is the point where Göbekli Tepe walks on stage. To Hancock, a site this sophisticated, this early, Built by people the textbooks file under simple foragers, does not look like a beginning at all. It looks like an inheritance. The hunter-gatherers, in his telling, did not dream this up out of nothing. They were taught by the refugees of a lost world, and Göbekli Tepe is one of the first places that older knowledge breaks back up through the surface. He points to the planning, the precision, the astronomy people read into the carvings, and he asks the question that does a lot of work for him. Where is the apprenticeship? Where are the clumsy early tries, the failed first drafts? Why does this appear so suddenly and so accomplished? It is, as a story, genuinely gripping, and it pulls on a very old human ache, the dream of a golden age lost under the water that we have spent the rest of history half remembering. And then you climb down into the dig and you look hard at what is actually in the ground. Flint blades, grinding stones, the butchered bones of wild gazelle and boar and aurochs, charcoal from old cooking fires, stone tools by the thousand, caught at every stage of being made. What you do not find is one single trace of the advanced teachers. No metal, no writing, no machinery, no fine goods carried in from a drowned homeland, nothing a local community with stone tools and a great deal of skill could not have made for themselves. And that missing apprenticeship Hancock asks about turns out to be there after all. It is just spread across the whole region, in the plainer, older sites and the everyday tools nearby that show people working their way up to this, step by patient step, exactly the way you would expect if they figured it out for themselves. So it is a captivating idea on very thin ground. Worth turning over as you drift off tonight, but the stones keep insisting, chip by chip, that they were made by local hands, learning as they went. And the fourth theory is, by a wide margin, the most famous of all four, the one nearly everyone listening has heard some version of. It is the idea that Göbekli Tepe was raised with help from somewhere beyond the earth, ancient aliens. The theory has a proper name, the ancient astronaut hypothesis, and a founding father, a Swiss author named Erich von Däniken, whose book Chariots of the Gods sold in the tens of millions and planted one sticky idea in the popular mind. The idea is this, that the great wonders of the ancient world were simply too advanced for the people who supposedly built them, so those people must have had help from visitors who came down out of the sky. Göbekli Tepe, surfacing so old and so accomplished, became a natural new exhibit for that argument, and it has been a fixture of the late-night television version of history ever since. Let's give it its strongest form, because the question underneath it really is a fair one. Look at what the place demanded. Pillars weighing many tons, cut from solid rock, carved with fine detail, lifted and lined up with real care by people with no metal, no wheel, no draft animals, and no writing to carry the plans from one mind to the next. How, the proponents ask, could Stone Age hunter-gatherers possibly have managed engineering on that scale? The precision looks too good, the scale too large, the date far too early. Something this far ahead of its time, they argue, needs an outside hand. And then they point straight at the stones themselves. Those tall, central pillars, the ones with the long-fingered hands and the carved belts, are not ancestors or guardians at all. the proponents say. They are portraits of the visitors, towering, faceless beings set down in stone by the awestruck people they came to. The animals become the visitors' emblems. The whole ring becomes a monument to contact. And the early date, to them, is the clincher, the supposed smoking gun. How else, they ask, could people fresh out of the Ice Age read the heavens or move stone like this, unless someone from elsewhere had shown them how? Here is where it lands, and it is the same ground the lost civilization story came to rest on. Every single object ever lifted out of that hill is human and earthly. Every chip of worked flint, every animal bone, every tool, every mark on every pillar is exactly what you would expect from human hands. Stone tools, rope, earth ramps, and an enormous amount of patient time. There is no scrap of alien metal, no cut that human tools could not make, no material from off the planet, nothing at all that needs a visitor to explain it. And the famous impossibility is not really one. We know it can be done without metal because it was done, and the plainer, older sites scattered across the same region show, step by step, people building up the skill to do it. The honest answer to how could Stone Age people possibly have managed this turns out to be the least mysterious answer in the world. They were a great deal cleverer and a great deal more capable than we have ever given them credit for. And there is something a little sad in handing the achievement to the stars, because the moment you do, you take the single most astonishing thing human beings ever pulled off this early, and you hand the credit to somebody else. The truth is the better story. People did this. People who had not yet invented the wheel did this with their own hands by working together on a cold hill at the edge of the world. I would much rather lie here amazed by them than by anybody from another planet. So what became of it? After all of that, the quarrying, the carving, the hauling, the feasting, the rings of Göbekli Tepe were filled in, packed with rubble and earth and old bones, until the giant stone people were buried up to their shoulders once more, and the hill closed over the top of them. And the reason why is, you will not be surprised to hear by now, argued over. For a long time, the answer was that they did it on purpose, a deliberate burial, a careful covering over, for reasons of their own. Newer work suggests it may be messier than that. Slopes washing down, walls collapsing, buildings repaired and half buried and built over again across a long, slow life, until the earth finally took the whole thing. Not one dramatic ending, but a long biography that simply wound down. And here is the part that turns it from a sad story into a strange and wonderful one. That burial is the only reason you get to hear about this place at all. A ring of carved stone left standing out in the open weathers, down to nothing in a few thousand years. Rain and frost and wind blur the foxes, blunt the vultures, topple the pillars, but buried it kept. Sealed under that pot-bellied hill, the carvings stayed as crisp as the day they were cut, the snakes still pouring, the vulture's wing still raised, waiting in the dark for 11,500 years, until a man who had read an old survey note came up the slope to look twice. And it turns out it was never alone up there. either. Just a few miles off sits another site, Karahan Tepe, with carved pillars of its own and stranger carvings still being uncovered. And beyond that, a whole scattering of related sites across that corner of Turkey, which the people who study them have started calling the Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills. Göbekli Tepe was not one miracle dropped onto an empty plain. It was the most famous building in a whole world of building, a wide community of people spread across a wide stretch of country, all reaching toward the same idea, with stone, at the same astonishing moment in the human story. Whatever moved them to do it, it moved a lot of them, across a lot of hills, for a very long time. There is a roof over it now, a wide modern shelter, a walkway that carries visitors out above the rings, a museum down the road in the city of Şanlıurfa, and a place on the official list of the most important sites in the world. You could go. It is a real spot, on a real map, open to anyone who makes the trip. The foxes are still there on the stone. The vulture is still there, wings still raised. And 11,500 years after a few hundred hunter-gatherers cut those figures out of the hill, you can stand at the railing, look one of those tall stone people in its blank, patient, faceless top, know almost nothing about why it was made, and feel anyway that somehow you recognize it. So let that be the last picture tonight. The rings of standing stones under their shelter, and in the middle of each circle, the two tall figures facing each other, the carved hand reaching toward the carved hand across the gap, long fingers nearly touching, the way they have nearly touched since before there were farms, or cities, or writing, or wheels. The people who made them are gone. Their names, their language, their gods, the meaning of every fox and snake and vulture. All of it has slipped too far back for us to follow. But the work is still here. The hands are gone. The thing the hands made remains, close enough to touch, too old to read. That is where we will leave it for tonight. The lights are low, the blanket is warm, your feet are tucked in. There is nothing left to do now but breathe slow and let yourself drift, while up on a pale ridge, 11,500 years ago, a few hundred people you will never meet finish raising a ring of stone, and the earth begins to close over it for the long, long wait until somebody comes back up the hill to find it again. Sleep well. We'll be right here tomorrow night with another one. It is the 4th of December, 1802, a little after 1 in the afternoon. About 400 miles off the Azores, a small cluster of Portuguese islands sitting alone out in the open Atlantic, another ship is going about her business. She's called the Dei Gratia, a Canadian-built merchant ship under a captain named David Morehouse, and she's bound from New York to Gibraltar with a hold full of petroleum. The man at the wheel notices a sail a few miles off. Nothing alarming about that. But as the two ships draw closer, the men on the Dei Gratia start to frown. The other ship is moving wrong. Her sails are set badly, some up, some missing, a couple just hanging loose. She wanders back and forth across the wind, the way a horse wanders when it works out that nobody's holding the reins. They watch her for 2 hours. In all that time, not one person appears on her deck. Nobody touches a sail. Nobody waves. Nobody comes to the rail to look back at them. So Captain Morehouse does the thing any sailor would do. He sends a boat across. 2 of his men, his mate, a steady fellow named Oliver DeVoe, and the second mate, climb up onto the deck of the silent ship, and they find nothing. Or rather, they find everything except the one thing they're looking for. They find no people. The deck is wet and a bit of a mess. There's water down in the hold, about 3.5 feet of it, which sounds alarming until you remember that this is a wooden sailing ship in December, and 3.5 feet of water in the bottom of one of those is roughly the maritime version of a damp basement. Annoying, worth pumping out, not a reason to abandon the building. One of the ship's 2 pumps has been taken apart. A length of rope is trailing over the side, down into the sea. The compass box has been knocked off its stand, and its glass is broken. Down in the cabin, it's stranger still, precisely because it's so ordinary. The captain's bunk, charts and papers, a sword lying in its scabbard under the bed, which is going to matter enormously to a very silly man in a little while, so do hold on to it. The crew's clothes, folded and left. 6 months of food and fresh water in the stores. The whole cargo, barrel after barrel, sitting untouched. Everything a person needs to stay alive is here. The persons are not. And lashed across one of the hatches there is an empty space and some cut rope where the ship's single small lifeboat, a little open boat called a yawl, used to be. It is gone. Wherever the 10 people went, they went in that boat, and they took the ship's papers with them and the captain's navigation instruments. They did not take their coats. They did not take their food. They left in a hurry, but not in a blind, screaming panic, because they stopped to grab the documents that mattered before they climbed down into the boat. And then the ship they left behind did something nobody expected. She kept going. For 9 days, with not one person aboard, she sailed herself across hundreds of miles of open Atlantic. Didn't sink, didn't roll over, just calmly carried on, like an employee who never got the message that the company had closed. Now, here I have to do something slightly annoying, which is to take a wonderful story away from you before I hand you a truer one. Because if you already knew the tale of the Mary Celeste before tonight, the version in your head probably goes something like this. A ghost ship, found drifting and dead silent. And down in the cabin, this is the famous part, a meal still sitting on the table, cups of tea still warm, a breakfast half eaten as though the crew had simply vanished mid-bite, a pot still steaming on the stove, a slice of pie with a forkful gone, washing hung out to dry on the deck, and, in some tellings, a cat, asleep and perfectly content on a locker, the only living thing left to see whatever unspeakable thing had happened. It's a fantastic image, genuinely. It has everything. The warmth still in the teacup, the people gone in a heartbeat, the cozy little scene frozen at the exact second the world ended for everyone in it. There is just one small problem with it, which is that essentially none of it is true. There was no warm tea. There was no half-eaten breakfast. There was no pie, no washing on the line, and there was, I'm sorry to report, no cat. We know this because the man who actually climbed aboard, the mate Oliver DeVoe, stood up in a courtroom a few weeks later and said so, under oath. His words were that there were, quote, no preparations for eating and nothing to eat or drink in the cabin. No meal, no set table, nothing. And even if there had been, even if there'd been a full roast dinner laid out under a little dome, it could not possibly have been warm. Because the last entry written in the ship's log was 10 days old by the time anyone found her. 10 days. You could leave a cup of tea sitting out for 10 days, come back, and find that it has developed a thick skin, a strong smell, and possibly some opinions. Nothing on that ship was steaming. So where did the warm tea come from? Where did the cat come from? Hold that question, because the answer is one of my favorite things in this entire story, and it involves a very famous author you have absolutely heard of, behaving in a way that would get him sued today. But before we get to the man who made all of that up, I want to do the thing the legend never bothers to do. I want to tell you who was actually on the ship, because they were real people, and they deserve better than to be furniture in a ghost story. The captain was a man named Benjamin Briggs. He was 37, from Massachusetts, one of 5 brothers who all went to sea. It was that kind of family. By every account, he was a careful, serious man. He read his Bible. He didn't drink. He was the sort of captain other people trusted, and he trusted himself for good reason, because he had been doing this his whole life. And he wasn't only the captain of the Mary Celeste. He'd put his own money into her. He was a part owner. In a real sense, this was his ship. With him was his wife, Sarah. They had been married 10 years, and with the 2 of them was their daughter, Sophia, who was 2 years old. They had another child as well, a little boy named Arthur, who was 7. Arthur was not on the ship. He'd been left at home with his grandmother because he was old enough now for school, and you don't pull a 7-year-old out of school to spend 2 months crossing the ocean. That decision, small, ordinary, sensible, to leave the older child home for the school term, is the only reason there is anyone left in this family at all. Remember Arthur? We'll come back to him. And then there was the crew. 7 men, hand-picked by Briggs himself, because a careful captain chooses careful men. His first mate, Albert Richardson, he knew and trusted personally. There was a second mate, a steward who did the cooking, and 4 German sailors, among them 2 brothers, Volkert and boy Lorenzen. 10 people, a family, and the men they sailed with. That is who was on the Mary Celeste. Not a ghost story. A small floating town of 10 people out on the water together. So let's go back to the start of the voyage, before any of it went wrong, when it was just an ordinary job. In early November of 1872, the Mary Celeste was tied up at a pier on the East River in New York, taking on her cargo. And the cargo is worth knowing about, because it matters later. She was carrying 1,700 barrels of alcohol. Not the drinking kind. This was raw industrial alcohol, the sort used in factories bound for Genoa in Italy, where it was going to be used in the making of wine. Briggs supervised the loading himself, barrel after barrel, down into the hold. While the ship was loading, Briggs wrote a letter to his mother. It's a completely ordinary letter, the kind of quick note you'd send today just to say all is well. But one line of it has survived, and it's a little hard to read now, knowing what's coming. He wrote, "Our vessel is in beautiful trim, and I hope we shall have a fine passage." In beautiful trim. He was proud of his ship. He thought she was in lovely shape. He was looking forward to a good crossing. They were meant to leave on the 5th of November, but Briggs didn't like the look of the weather. So he did the careful thing, the thing he always did, and anchored just off Staten Island and waited 2 days for it to settle. And during that wait, his wife Sarah wrote a letter too, to her mother-in-law back home. In it, she mentions Arthur, the little boy they'd left behind. She writes, "Tell Arthur I make great dependence on the letters I shall get from him." She is telling her 7-year-old, through his grandmother, that she is counting on his letters, that she wants to hear from him while she's away. It is the most ordinary, most human line in this entire story. A mother, about to be out of reach for 2 months, asking her little boy to please write to her. On the 7th of November, the weather cleared, and the Mary Celeste sailed out into the open Atlantic. The last thing anyone ever wrote in her logbook was a plain position note on the morning of the 25th of November. It placed her right beside a small island in the Azores called Santa Maria. After that, the log is blank. Whatever happened to the 10 people on board happened somewhere past that quiet, ordinary morning. Out beyond the last island, in open water, with no one else around for hundreds of miles. So picture the spot Captain Morehouse of the Dei Gratia is now in. He's in the middle of the ocean, and he has just found a perfectly good ship with nobody on it. By the law of the sea, a ship found abandoned like that is salvage. If you can bring her safely into port, you're owed a reward, often a healthy share of what the ship and her cargo are worth. So this is, potentially, a very good day for Captain Morehouse. But it's also a problem, because he now has 2 ships and only 1 crew. So he splits his men. He sends his mate DeVoe and 2 sailors back aboard the Mary Celeste to sail her, keeps the rest on his own ship, and the 2 vessels set off together for the nearest sensible port, which is Gibraltar, the great rock at the mouth of the Mediterranean, about 600 miles away. They make it in just under 2 weeks, the 4-man skeleton crew nursing the silent ship the whole way, and they come into Gibraltar in the middle of December. And this is the point where the story should simply have ended. A ship found empty, brought safely into port, the salvage men paid, the whole thing filed under "The ocean is enormous, and sometimes a thing happens out on it that is never fully explained." That is how it should have gone. It is not how it went, because waiting in Gibraltar was a man who looked at this sad, soggy, empty little ship and saw the crime of the century. His name, and I promise you I am not inventing this, was Frederick Solly Flood. He was the Attorney General of Gibraltar, which is a very grand title, and he had a personality built to match it. One historian who studied the case later described him as a man whose, quote, "arrogance and pomposity were inversely proportional to his IQ," which is a beautifully polite way of saying the less he understood about a thing, the more certain of himself he became. And Frederick Solly Flood was certain that the Mary Celeste was the scene of a terrible crime. He had theories. Oh, he had theories. Perhaps the crew had broken into the alcohol cargo, gone mad with drink, murdered the captain and his family, and fled. Perhaps Captain Morehouse and the men of the Dei Gratia had crept up on the Mary Celeste, killed everyone aboard, and invented the whole "we found her abandoned" story to collect the salvage money. Murder, mutiny, conspiracy. Solly Flood was open to all of them, so long as it was a crime, because a man does not get this excited about a damp basement and some missing rope. So he investigated for 3 months, and he went looking for evidence of a slaughter with the tireless energy of a man who has already decided exactly what he is going to find. He found the sword, the one under the captain's bunk. I told you to hold on to it. He drew it out, and there were stains on the blade, and Solly Flood knew, that he was looking at dried blood. He found dark marks cut into the timbers of the hull near the bow, and he became convinced they'd been made with an axe or a blade. Signs of violence, evidence of the massacre. He had it. He had his crime. And then he made the fatal mistake of letting people who actually knew things look at his evidence. The stains on the sword were sent off to be properly analyzed. They were not blood. They were rust, with perhaps a trace of something like spilled lemon. The sinister cuts on the hull were examined by a captain from the United States Navy, who took one look and explained that they were entirely natural, just the ordinary way the sea works at the timbers of a wooden ship over the years. Not an axe, not a blade. Water and wood and time. Every single piece of Frederick Solly Flood's great murder case turned out to be the nautical equivalent of being startled in the dark by your own coat hanging on the back of a door. He spent 3 months hunting killers, and what he had actually found was rust, weathering, and his own imagination. In the end, he had to let the ship go, though he never quite let the suspicion go. The salvage reward the Dei Gratia men finally received was unusually small, a quiet little insult from officials who couldn't prove a thing but didn't want to look as though they'd missed one. So if the warm tea and the sleeping cat were in nobody's courtroom testimony, if the real evidence was rust and weathered wood, then where did the ghost ship come from? Where did all those gorgeous, specific, utterly invented little details come from? They came from a 24-year-old doctor who wasn't a very busy doctor yet, and who was earning a bit of extra money on the side by writing stories. His name was Arthur Conan Doyle. Yes, that one. The man who, a few years later, would invent Sherlock Holmes. In 1884, 12 years after the Mary Celeste was found empty, Doyle published a short story. He published it anonymously in a magazine, written as a first-person account by a survivor of the abandoned ship, telling the true tale of what had happened aboard. It was fiction. Complete fiction. He took the real, genuinely strange case and he decorated it. He added the perfectly set breakfast table. He added the abandoned mid-meal feeling. He built a dramatic, entirely invented plot of murder and revenge on top of it. He gave the public the spooky, satisfying ghost ship that the real, soggy facts had stubbornly refused to provide. And he made 2 changes that tell you everything you need to know. The rescuing ship, the Dei Gratia, he left almost exactly as she was. He kept her name perfectly correct. But the famous ship, the empty one, he renamed. He called her the Mary Celeste. Marie, spelled the French way, with an IE on the end. The real ship was the Mary Celeste. Mary, the plain English name. And here is the part I find genuinely remarkable. Doyle's made-up French misspelling, Marie Celeste, became, for the next 100 years, the way most of the world spelled and said the name of this ship. The fiction was so much more popular than the facts that it quietly painted over them. People learned the wrong name from a short story and then taught the wrong name to their children. It got worse, or better, depending on how you feel about these things. Doyle's story was so convincing that a newspaper, the Boston Herald, actually reprinted it as a true news report, a work of fiction printed in the paper as fact. And there are accounts that even our friend Frederick Solly Flood, the great investigator himself, read Doyle's little story and took parts of it seriously, which raises the lovely possibility that the official who investigated the real ship ended up muddled by a tale a novelist made up about her. After Doyle, the gates were open and everyone piled in. Over the years, people decided the Mary Celeste had been attacked by a giant squid, or struck by a freak wave that washed every soul off the deck, but somehow left the breakfast untouched, or that it was aliens, or sea monsters, or a curse. Eventually, and she vanished nowhere near the place, people began filing her under the Bermuda Triangle, which is the folklore equivalent of blaming anything you can't explain on the one spooky thing you happen to have heard of. It became a kind of theory circus, and the thing about a circus is that it's a great deal of fun, and none of it is real. And meanwhile, the 10 actual people who climbed down into that little boat have been quietly buried under 100 years of squid. So let's sweep the squid and the curse and the French misspelling off the table and ask the real question, the quiet one, underneath all the noise. If there was no crime and no monster and no warm tea, then what actually happened to Benjamin Briggs, his family, and his crew? We don't know for certain. We never will. No bodies were ever found. The little boat was never found. There is no last page of the log to tell us. And anyone who claims to know exactly what happened on that ship is doing precisely what Conan Doyle did, making up a good story. But we can make a careful guess from the real clues the boarding party actually found. It's only a theory. It just happens to be the one nearly everyone who studies this case ends up landing on, and the kind of guess Captain Briggs himself would have respected. Remember the things aboard that ship that didn't quite fit? One of the pumps had been taken apart. A sounding rod, a tool for measuring how much water is down in the hold, was lying out on the deck, as if someone had been urgently checking the level. There were a few feet of water below, and the cargo was 1,700 barrels of alcohol, 9 of which were later found to be empty. They had leaked. Now stand for a moment where Briggs was standing. You are a careful captain, and you become aware of 2 frightening things at once. There is water in your hold and a pump that isn't working properly, so you can't easily tell how fast you're taking it on. And a bad reading off that sounding rod could make it look as if you're sinking far faster than you really are. And at the very same time, you may be smelling alcohol fumes rising up out of the hold from those leaking barrels, in an age before anyone properly understood how and when fumes like that might catch and explode. You are standing on a wooden ship that might be filling with water and might also be about to blow up. So you make a decision, not a wild one, a careful one, the sort you have trained for your whole life. You put your wife, your 2-year-old daughter, and your 7 crewmen into the ship's small boat. You tie the small boat to the ship with a rope so you won't lose her, and you pull off a short distance, and you wait. You wait to see whether the ship is going to sink or burn or simply settle down and be fine. It is the sensible plan. Stay close. Stay tied on. Ride out the danger in the boat and climb back aboard once it passes. And then the one thing you did not plan for happens. The wind comes up. The rope joining the little boat to the ship parts, snaps, or has to be cut in the rising sea. And in a moment, the gap between the small open boat and the big ship begins to open, and it keeps opening, because the ship still has sails set, and the small boat has 10 frightened people and a pair of oars. The Mary Celeste sails away from them, calmly, steadily, exactly the way we watched her sail at the very beginning of tonight's story. Except now there are 10 people in an open boat behind her, watching their ship, their food, their shelter, their entire chance of living, shrink against the horizon and go. They were off the Azores, in the open Atlantic, in December, in a small open boat, a real family, and 7 real men. Almost certainly, they drowned. The most likely reason is not a curse and not a crime. It's that a good captain made a reasonable decision on bad information and was unlucky with the weather. That is the whole monster in the end. The wind and a frayed rope and a few feet of water that may not even have been as dangerous as it looked. And the ship herself? You'd think a vessel with a story like that would be owed a story-like ending. A grand one. Lost in a storm with all her mysteries still aboard, perhaps, or quietly retired and remembered. She got nothing so kind. After Gibraltar, the Mary Celeste was a marked ship. Word had gone round. She was the ship where everyone vanished, the unlucky one, the one nobody wanted. Sailors are superstitious, and owners are practical, and a ship with a reputation like that is hard to crew and hard to make money with. She changed hands again and again, and she lost money for nearly everyone who touched her for 13 years. And then, in 1885, she fell into the hands of a captain named Gilman Parker. And Gilman Parker looked at this famous, unlucky, money-losing ship, and he had an idea. Not a romantic idea. A grubby one. He loaded her up with a cargo that he insured for far, far more than it was actually worth. By the accounts, it was largely junk, dressed up on paper as something valuable. And then he deliberately sailed the Mary Celeste onto a coral reef off the coast of Haiti. On purpose. He wrecked her so that he could collect the insurance money on a cargo that had never been worth much at all. It is about the least mysterious thing a person can do to a ship. It is just fraud. The famous ghost ship, the vessel of 1,000 sea monster theories, was killed on purpose for a cheap insurance scam by a man trying to make a quick and dishonest dollar. And it didn't even work. The scheme was clumsy, and it came apart, and Gilman Parker was put on trial in Boston, not only for fraud, but for a crime with the wonderful old name of barratry, which, when it means wrecking a ship on purpose like this, was once serious enough that a man could hang for it. Parker didn't hang. The jury couldn't agree, and the case was settled out. But he was finished, ruined, disgraced, his money and his good name gone. He died in poverty just a few months later. And the ship's real logbook, the one with the real final entries, was lost around the same time. Which is the reason that, to this very day, the only surviving record of the Mary Celeste's last course is a copy made by none other than Frederick Solly Flood, the pompous prosecutor who got everything else about her wrong. So that is the true ending. Not a ghost ship sailing on forever into the mist. A tired old vessel run up onto a reef on purpose for the insurance money by a man who died broke for having done it. The legend is grander, I'll give it that. But this, the cheap, sad, ordinary human truth of it, is what actually happened. And that is the Mary Celeste. Not the version with the warm tea and the sleeping cat. That one belongs to a young writer with a magazine deadline. The real one is quieter and sadder, and in its own way far stranger. 10 ordinary people who did a sensible thing and were lost for it. A ship that sailed herself across the ocean and was then wrecked on purpose for a few dishonest dollars. And a mystery that turned out to be made not of monsters, but of weather and rust, and the stories people couldn't stop telling about her. There is one piece of it I want to leave you with, though, the closest thing this story has to a mercy. Remember Arthur, the little boy, 7 years old, left home with his grandmother so he wouldn't miss the school term, because his parents made that small, ordinary, sensible decision. Arthur was not on the ship. He grew up. He lived a long life. The family that went out onto the water did not all go. One of them stayed home by chance and a school calendar and carried on. We don't get to know the last hours of the people in that little boat. No one does, and no one ever will. But we don't have to be frightened of it, you and I, here, tonight, because wherever you are listening from, you are not in a small boat in a December ocean. You are warm. You are dry. You are still. The cold Atlantic is far away and 150 years in the past. And tonight, the only thing you have to do is let this quiet story carry you off to sleep. So let the ship go. Let her sail off the edge of the story, the same way she sailed off toward the horizon. Quiet, unbothered, and finally done. Let the questions stay unanswered. They're allowed to be. And let yourself rest. Sleep well, and we will be right here to do this for you again tomorrow night.